Hi everyone, Nigel Saunders here. Today I will be working on my jade forest. This forest was created 2 years ago from plants and cuttings, and I defoliated everything before I planted it and arranged everything, and now it's grown in and matured, and it's time for pruning. Jades are often thought of as a beginner's plant and not really given much respect in the bonsai community. But a really old ancient jade, well shaped and well pruned, can rival any bonsai that I've ever seen. I just find them magnificent. When a jade gets old, they start to get a beautiful silvery bark on the trunks. They can flower. You can shape them into any style you want, and they're easy to care for. The jade plant comes from Africa, and it's a succulent plant. It stores water in the trunk and the leaves. And there's several different varieties you can get. This one here is called the Hobbit jade or the Gollum jade, or sometimes the pencil jade, because the leaves are long and cylindrical. Jades can be kept small or grown large. The one that I showed you in flower, that's about 17 years old and it's stayed a small tree for most of its life. If you grow them in a larger pot, they'll grow into a giant fat trunk tree. So it's up to you. If you want a large plant, let it grow. If you want a small tree, keep it pruned and in a small container. I'm going to begin work on the forest now, and before I start working on it, I have to imagine what style I want these trees in. Pictures of wild jade trees growing in Africa aren't easy to find on the internet, but there is a few photographs out there. Usually they're a big thick-trunked tree that looks something like this, sort of a small bush, and usually there's parts of them that are just withered and blackened by the weather. Parts of them die off from lack of water, and then they rejuvenate certain sections, and they're quite unique looking as a tree. I added the linus in here to kind of give that African theme to the planting, and I don't really like it there. If I take it away, you can see into the planting more. It gives it more depth. It doesn't kind of cut off the planting in half. I think it also lets you use your imagination to imagine how large these trees are, rather than if I have the line there, it's definitely, well, the line's about this high, you know, kind of how high these would be in nature. So it kind of leaves that up to your imagination. You can envision them as large trees or small trees. I'm going to start today by cleaning up the landscape. I used a layer of sand on top of this planting to give it that kind of desert look. And I used a mixture of 50% white industrial sand for sandblasting and 50% playground sand, which is that, typical brown sand that you see in playgrounds. So over the years, it starts to discolor on the surface, and that's because it starts to grow moss. And if I scrape it away, you'll see it's just the top layer. It starts to develop algae, and it must get moss spores that are growing. If I left this layer on here much longer, it would grow moss on here for sure. I've seen it happen many times. So today I'm going to start by cleaning up all the leaves that have fallen off, the dead leaves, and cleaning up the surface of the soil. I'll use the sharp end on my tweezers to come in and just scrape off a light layer of soil. And if it's too shallow, then you can always add a new layer of sand. I'll also be picking up all the dead leaves that have fallen off and dried up on the surface of the soil. So just a general cleanup. Some people might like the look of the moss on the desert plants, but I prefer that kind of dry desert look. When you're working on a jade, it's important to let the soil dry out before you do any pruning. Right now it's got lots of foliage and it can draw water out of the soil and disperse it into the air. But when you reduce that upper canopy, when you're pruning it, and you have too much moisture in the soil, you could get root rot because it's not using as much water, the plant. So if you let it dry out before you do your pruning, and then after your pruning, don't water it again. Wait until you see new growth coming in, and then you can start increasing the water. You can mist them anytime, but just don't heavily water them. It is a cold, windy day out today. You might hear the wind blowing in the background. It's about -6 degrees Celsius, so it feels pretty chilly out there. I've got most of the green algae and moss off the surface of the sand. So now I'll just clean up my planting. I've got a little shaving brush here that I can just clean everything up with. I've got the soil surface all cleaned up nicely now. And I think you agree it looks more desert-like with the sand color. If you do have moss, you can just put little tufts of it here and there, and it looks like some kind of small desert plants. They can look quite nice. So now comes the styling part. Choosing a style for your jade is probably one of the most difficult decisions you'll make. I've seen them styled into triangular pine-type trees. I've seen them with great big canopies like a deciduous tree. I've seen them tall and skinny, short and fat. I've seen every style imaginable, and they can all look really good. It's just your personal choice of what you pick. For this style, I'm going to try and keep these trees fairly short. This isn't a large forest, so I can't let them grow into giant trees. So I'm going to keep them fairly short, and my idea is to grow them fairly wide and thick. So I think that'll look quite good. It's pretty close to their natural style too, is to get that short, fat, thick trunk with, a moderate canopy on them. The structure of the tree is also part of the style. You can have very angular branches with sharp bends in them, or you can have smooth flowing branches. And you can pick either. Either looks good. It's up to you. For my trees here, I want to keep the branches fairly short with lots of movement, and I want to get a lot of taper, so the branch starts off thick and gets thin very quickly. So you can see on this tree, some of the branches, they start off this diameter and it maintains that diameter right out to about here. So there's a fairly long section where it doesn't really taper. So it may involve cutting those back today to get more taper in those branches. On this tree you can see the new growth. It starts here and it's getting quite tall. It goes to about here, straight with no taper. So those type of shoots will need to be pruned back. I've taken a look at the overall view of the forest, and I can see it's getting quite dense in some areas, and some of these back trees are getting too tall. It doesn't give you that sense of forest perspective, so I'll keep that in mind when I'm pruning also. I'm going to start by pruning the main tree down in height, and that'll give me an idea of how short I need to make these trees towards the back to give that forest perspective. I'll start by pruning down the new growth, coming back to a leaf facing outwards here, like that. All these cuttings will grow if you plant them. Jades grow really easily from cuttings. So here's a case. This branch is quite long, so I'm going to prune it heavily right back to here. I've got my spinning tree bonsai turntable out, and that'll make the pruning a lot easier. I'll continue to prune up the upper canopies, reducing them down in height, pruning just above an outward facing leaf, trying to prune the branches back to get taper and movement. There's that wind blowing outside. Any branches that are growing in towards the center of the tree can be removed. You don't want to clutter up the interior of your tree. You can remove leaves that are going in towards the center also, just to clean it up a bit. Any leaves that are discolored or ready to fall off, just clean those out too. It'll clean up the structure a little so you can see the branches a little more clearly, so it's not quite so cluttered. It'll give you a better idea for styling. You can see how the #1 tree here is looking lighter already. You can see in a little better. I've got a branch here that kind of grows towards the inside here. So that would look better without that branch. I'll give you a close-up of that. Here's a close-up of that branch that's growing in towards the center of the tree. So I'll remove that entirely. Like that. That cleans up the structure of the tree quite a bit from the front view. I'll also prune off this long branch here. Back to here. Keeping my internodes short. I've got a long branch coming up the center that's quite tall, has very little taper and very little movement. So I will prune that one back to, let me see. I need to look at it in the front view. Yeah, I think right back to about here. Like that. Taking quite a bit off. Now there's a branch out the back here. There's one kind of growing towards the inside I'll remove. Like that. And then I'll shorten this one back to here. Okay, let's take a look at the main tree from the front view now. This area here is a little confusing. I have this thick kind of trunk rising up from the base of the tree, and I like that. I don't want to prune that off. And then I've got this one that kind of interferes with it and makes this section look very cluttered. I'm after taper and change of direction, so I have this thick branch here and I have a shoot coming out the front. So if I were to prune off this section of it, I would get really good taper and a nice change of direction. And it would solve my problem with clutter there. So that's what I'll do. Here I go. Pruning off this section, which is a big cut. Like that. I'm also going to reduce the length of this branch down. It's quite long without any taper. So we'll go right back to here. Like that. My upright leaders are quite long with very little taper too, so I'm going to prune those back shorter. I'll start with the front one here. I think I'll go back to about here. Like that. And this one will be a similar height. I'll come back to here. Like that. I've got the height of, I'll just take this leaf off, but I've got the height of this side branch is kind of equal or just slightly lower than the main height of the tree, and I think that's too much of a difference. I think this needs to be reduced back, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to take it back, and I'm trying to decide where. It's nice to have this branching here, but it'll develop new stuff from down below, so I'm going to take it back to here. Like that. I think that's cleaned up the structure of the main tree quite a bit. It'll really improve the quality of the tree for the future. It's a little horrifying looking now, but once it starts to grow in with new leaves and foliage, it'll look quite good. I'll prune up the rest of the trees using the same principles, trying to get a nice basic structure to the tree, trying to get taper and movement to the branches, and then we'll come back and have a look at it. Here's a look at the cutting room floor. There's some really nice cuttings in there. Some good thick stuff. So let's have a look at the forest now. Here's a look at the jade forest now. I did a lot of structural work, getting the basic trunks in proportion. I did a lot of heavy cuts, getting rid of a lot of crisscrossing branches, trying to clean up the basic structure of the tree and trying to get them to all kind of work together as a unit for the whole forest. And I think it's getting there. I'm sure there'll be more cuts coming in the future, but But yeah, I'm quite happy with the progress of this forest, and I think once the foliage starts coming out, it'll look quite wonderful. I hope. When a jade forest is reduced back like this, it needs very little water. There's enough water stored in the trunks to get the new foliage going. Once the leaves do start to come out, you can give it a light misting. Not enough to wet the soil, but just enough to dampen the leaves, and that'll help them along. It should take, 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks before it starts to fill out. And we'll come back and have a look at it then. There's a cutting in the back here that's rooted, but it's a little unstable still, so I have it leaning against a rock just to hold it in place until it develops a better root system. I'll rotate my small jade forest around so you can see it from all angles, so here we go. There is still some green leaves left on it, not many. Back to the front. That's all the work I'll be doing on my jade forest today. I'm Nigel Saunders. Thanks for joining me in the Bonsai Zone.